Just a couple of things before we actually do get going. First of all, please take time after the event to go over and look at the posters that the students from the Economics and Sustainability course have created. They're very well done, they're very informative. Some of the issues that we actually will touch upon here tonight are probably dealt with in more depth on the posters. Carbon taxes, internal carbon taxes, and issues like that. And actually help me just applauding them for the work they did here. A couple of announcements of upcoming events, some of which are relevant and some of which are not as relevant, but assuming that everyone here has a social conscience of one level or another, I'm going to assume they're all relevant. Tomorrow night, actually, Dr. Malik and I both, I'll be moderating a different type of panel. It's called From Fear to Freedom, Fighting Islamophobia. And it's a panel which is comprised of a number of leading Muslims in the community to talk about the local response to what has been going on globally and nationally, and the spike in Islamophobia that has been one of the consequences of that. So it's at the Freedom Center, 7 o'clock, it's free and open to the public. The other event is next week, which is, again, Brigham Center and the ERS and CUCI and the Ohio Humanities Council are sponsoring the Cooperative Economy, Building a Sustainable Future. Sustainable here having that kind of a double edge of being environmentally sustainable and economically sustainable, but looking at how and whether worker-owned cooperatives and new models of cooperative-owned businesses really represent a new emerging fourth sector in the United States. We have some good examples here locally. We have national speakers coming in. It's an all-day conference. If you're interested in that, go to the Brueggemann Center website or go to the ERS website to find out about it. And then finally, directly relating to this, on June 10th, for those of you who are still in town, is a thing actually Scott and I work on together, is the Midwest Regional Sustainability Summit. The Brueggemann Center partners with the City of Cincinnati and Green Umbrella. This is our second year of doing this. It has evolved through the years, through the 3E conference to become a conference that is looking at innovation and collaboration throughout the region. How can we become a more environmentally collaborative and innovative region? We have Paul Hawken coming in as a plenary speaker. Paul Hawken wrote Ecology of Commerce, Natural Capitalism, and he has a new project called Drawdown, which is a catalog of the 100 most important innovations he believes are out there to help us fight climate change. A dynamic and really important, significant figure will be in, and that'll be June 10th. And again, you can either go to the Green Umbrella website, which is actually where I would direct you to the Green Umbrella website for lots of reasons, to register for this. But if you really want to get involved in collective action in this region, in anything environmental, and Scott will have more to say about this, Green Umbrella is the place to do it. It's an organization that many of us have been involved with since its beginning, and has grown into over 300 organizations and groups that are now working together to try to make our region a more environmentally sustainable region. So there are flyers up here, not to be taken out, but you can look at these afterwards, and if you have questions about any of these, talk to Scott, Ron, or myself. Let me begin, before I introduce the panel, with just a brief timeline on the Paris Accords. In 1992, the United Nations Conference on Environment and Development, which became known as the Earth Summit, was held. There were a series of preparatory conferences which went on from 1989 to 1992. I was very happy to have been one of the negotiators of that. I was on the biotechnology negotiating team. We did not even survive the Nairobi PrepCom, and we ended up with only minor parts in Agenda 21 and the Biodiversity Treaty, we still believe that biotechnology should have been a convention. It still is a major player in what's going on environmentally. We met in Rio technically between June 3rd and 14th. Those of us who were actually involved were in Rio for about 6 weeks in 1992. It resulted in the Rio Declaration, a big document called Agenda 21, the Forest Principles, the Convention on Biological Diversity, the United Nations Convention to Combat Desertification, and then finally the Framework Convention on Climate Change. And the Framework Convention on Climate Change is the framework within which all of this has happened since then. This led to the United Nations Climate Change Conferences, which began in 1995, and they're held yearly. They're held in the framework of United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which I just mentioned. We usually talk about that as the UNFCCC. I mean, that's always the lingo for it. They serve as the formal meeting for the UNFCCC parties, and there's a difference between the conference of the parties serving the meeting parties and the conference of the parties. And if you go into this document, you'll begin to see the difference. There's different statuses. So the conference on the parties to assess progress in dealing with climate change, and beginning in the mid-90s to negotiate the Kyoto Protocol to establish legally binding obligations for developed countries to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. From 2001, the conferences have also served as a conference of the parties serving as the meeting parties to the Kyoto Protocols. Now what that meant was we vastly expanded the number of people that were involved in the negotiations and who were impacted and had obligations in a variety of ways relative to these documents. So there's a kind of hierarchy of obligations going from the developed countries down to the developing countries down to the very seriously stressed developing countries and the role that they need to play in this. Also with the parties of the convention. From 2011, the meetings have also been used to negotiate and to get ready for the Paris Agreement as part of what we call the Durban Platform, which really took place in 2015. So they began in 1995. There are up to date 22 iterations of these meetings that have gone on. The key ones are 1997, which was the Kyoto Protocol on Climate Change, 2005, which was the Montreal meeting, which was the first meeting of the parties. This is where we vastly expanded the number of people who were involved in these negotiations and were taken into consideration and their voices. One good example of this would be the Pacific Islands. The Pacific Islands are not going to survive climate change. I don't care what we do. They're not going to survive it. Their voice before 1995 was not, or 2005, was not even considered as part of what is going on. They became part of it. Then in 2011, the meeting in Durban, South Africa, which really began a formal agenda leading up to the Paris Accords, which we'll be looking at tonight, which took place in 2015. So that's a kind of brief history of what brought us to Paris. Let me introduce our panelists, and what they're going to do is each one will make brief opening statements, then we'll engage in a conversation up here, and then we'll open it up to the floor and have a joint conversation amongst us all. And I'm expecting some really informed questions from my left over here, you poster makers. Scott Hassel, on my far right, not politically, but just really on my far right, actually on your left, so, is the Director of Environmental Affairs at Fifth Third Bank. He co-leads the bank's efforts to develop and implement a comprehensive corporate environmental sustainability program that includes green building, recycling, energy efficiency, renewable energy, voluntary reporting, employee engagement, and managing the risks and opportunities related to climate change. Scott is president and board of the aforementioned Green Umbrella, the Regional Sustainability Alliance for the Greater Cincinnati region. Scott is the past chair of of the Greater Cincinnati Green Business Council, another very important organization, both nationally and in our own community. Anas Malik is an associate professor of political science here at Xavier and an affiliated faculty in the Vincent and Eleanor Ostrom Workshop in Political Theory and Policy Analysis at Indiana University in Bloomington. If you don't know Ostrom's work, Governing the Commons, very important work. For that work and other work she did, she won the Nobel Prize in Economics. So she's a towering figure, both in terms of economics and how you apply economics to some of the issues that we're going to talk about. And the workshop that he's part of is really doing some extraordinary work on managing the commons. He is the author of Political Survival in Pakistan Beyond Ideology, which was published in 2011, and has research interest in polycentric governance, which I'm assuming he may mention, I don't know, tonight, and collective action, which will come up continuously, but his focus is on Islamic and interreligious context. John Snagaki is Associate Professor of Religious in the Department of Theology, with his specialty being religious ethics, and is the director of Xavier's Peace and Justice Studies minor. He's authored a book entitled Catholic Social Teaching and Economic Globalization, The Quest for Alternatives, which was published at Marquette, and is currently working on a book on food ethics. He explores issues of climate change in all of his courses. And finally, me, I'm a university professor and director of the Brueggemann Center for Dialogue. My work in environment, as I say, goes back to the mid-'80s. I've been involved in it globally. I've been involved in it in Asia. I've been involved in it in everywhere I've been and remain involved in it here. So I currently work in with groups in a lot of ways. One of the things that becomes interesting to me is because I'm working on neighborhood economic development in one sector of my life and sustainability in the other, and it does go back to my Rio experience. What happened in Rio was this statement that we thought that environmental issues were over here and poverty and equity issues were over here. What Rio, what your summit was about was that's not the case. They're one systemic problem, and they need to be addressed systemically. One of the things that I'm trying to get the groups here to do is to combine the environmental sustainability work with the economic and equity work that's going on and to see how we can do that locally. So that's another charge that we have. Doesn't relate to tonight, but it's a very important topic. So we'll start with Scott Hassel. So Scott, if you take us away with some comments, please.
All right, you bet. Can everybody hear me all right? First, I want to thank you all for coming. This is a very important topic, and it's really important that you all figure out how to bring your passion and your energy and your skills to solving these issues. And all those meetings that James described, at some level it's not kind of overwhelming and boring. The details really matter, and it's just because of that constant grind of people trying to make a difference and move us in the right direction that we're getting where we are. I also want to congratulate the students on their great posters, and thank Xavier, James, Nancy, and everybody in this community for everything that you do to advance sustainability. Here in Greater Cincinnati, Xavier just does a tremendous amount, and I'm really appreciative for that. Let's see. Today I am speaking primarily for myself. Mostly I'm not speaking for Fifth Third. If some questions come up, I might talk about that a little bit. But let me jump into COP21, the Conference of the Parties 21 in Paris, and why it was a success. It was a success because it changed this 20-year-old framework from the Kyoto Protocol about how countries are going to work together to address climate change. The old system put developed countries and developing countries into two different groups, and that created tension between the groups and within the groups. James mentioned the Pacific Island states. You can see how if you just lump all developing countries in together, China on the one hand, small island states, in the same group, that it's not going to be easy to get the kind of convergence that we need for an agreement. So part of what was really wonderful with what happened in Paris was that we replaced that system with a new one that removed the differentiation between developed and developing countries, and it asked each country to put forward their own best effort. It was called an intended nationally determined contribution, and then to strengthen those in the future. And so basically every country was asked to say, hey, what could you do by 2030? And and you could propose things that were different based on your capabilities. And so as you start thinking about economics, especially those of you who made those posters, different countries do have different capabilities to respond to things. And before the Conference of the Parties started, 186 countries had made a voluntary pledge of what they were going to do. That's more than 90% of the global emissions. So the Conference of the Parties also, or the Paris Agreement also called for regular reporting and updates, with the idea being that countries had to regularly report on their progress, and they had to set newer, higher standards every 5 years. The idea was that you keep improving. And one of the things that's really important is to recognize that the pledges that everyone made going into Paris are not sufficient to stop climate change. But this whole new process is sufficient to finally get us started. So that, I think, is what was really, really important about Paris, was we can finally stop arguing between these different factions and start getting into the hard work. Another piece that I want to mention is that part of this agreement also called for developing a new mechanism to allow emissions reductions in one country to be counted towards another country's independently, nationally determined contributions. So again, going back to those charts and the laws of supply and demand and economics, that's really important because that allows trading. So that is yet to be worked out, but it's really important. Some key reasons why an agreement was reached. Climate change is having universal negative impacts on countries worldwide. It's become clear to people that things are bad and they're going to get worse, and so in order to start addressing them, we have to get started. So I think that just creates that's different than it has been in the past. Also really important, the US and China, the world's largest emitters, who had been in opposite camps previously, came together and said, we need to reach an agreement. They worked for many, many years to make sure that an agreement was reached. China and the US made some big announcements in the lead up to, even in late 2014. China committed to peaking and reducing its greenhouse gas emissions, launching a domestic trading system in China in 2016, and they have made tremendous progress if you look at what they've actually done in China. COP21 also called for countries to make a commitment, or by calling for countries to make a commitment before the meeting, they arrived at the meeting wanting to see it succeed. The leaders of these countries had already invested a lot of time in coming up with a rigorous, good document, and so they didn't want to come and just kind of blow that. And so when you think about the dynamics of how do you try to get people to come to an agreement, I think this was a really good strategy. Of course, when it opened, there were 150 presidents and prime ministers there, the largest ever single-day gathering of heads of state. And that is amazing. And this was, of course, just a week or two after the bombings in Paris as well. So when you think about the kind of commitment that was signaling, it was really an unprecedented moment. There was also a lot of momentum from non-state actors, that means governors, mayors, corporate leaders, associations, philanthropists, NGOs, you name it. Many papers were published, initiatives were announced. I mean, it was unbelievable. In the 18 years I've worked on these issues, I've never seen anything like that run up to Paris. And during the negotiations, China played a really important role in keeping developing countries focused on getting an agreement. I mentioned that there's a lot of heterogeneity among developing countries, and China played a huge role in keeping everybody on message and figuring out how to solve any problems that countries had. And then, of course, at the end, 195 countries reached an agreement. So that was just amazing. Some broader trends leading to progress, and I'll run through these quickly and hand it off. Obviously, it is getting warmer. NOAA, in 2015, NOAA, the National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration, named 2015 the warmest year on record by a wide margin. It was 0.29 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than the prior year, so almost 30 degrees warmer than just the prior year. It was 1.6 degrees above the 20th century average. So these are starting to be really, really big numbers. Other things that I think are just really interesting, the coal and the natural gas markets are doing some very interesting things. Low natural gas prices, along with policy and market drivers that are trying to get electric utilities and others to be more cognizant about greenhouse gas emissions. These are really leading to changes in the nation's power mix. We see it in a lot of different ways. It's very much helped by low natural gas prices, but this is also affecting the coal market. Coal production dropped 10% in 2015, reaching a 30-year low. Arch Coal, the second largest coal mining company in the U.S., declared Chapter 11 bankruptcy. And there's worries mounting that the way that the coal industry funds cleanups and remediation, basically, at mines, there's concern that it may call into question the future of the coal industry. It's basically they would fund remediation out of their profits. And so as the profits have declined, there's concern that the ability to remediate and clean up these mines, they may not be able to fund that, in which case it's going to create liabilities for those who hold the bonds for those things. Renewable energy, there's a lot going on there. Falling costs, greater experience, leading to new business models and finance models, increased corporate leadership, and the renewal of some key tax credits that happened just late last year. And then on the finance side, this is the last set of things I'll talk about, there really has been a lot of change in 2015. BlackRock, which is the largest asset management company in the world, was quoted as saying that investors are in the midst of transitioning from the art to the science of carbon exposure measurement. And this is driven by the availability of credible data across a broad range of the market. And this is because of groups like the Carbon Disclosure Project, which have created incentives for companies to voluntarily declare what their greenhouse gas emissions are, what they're doing to manage those risks and those opportunities. This Carbon Disclosure Project, the CDP, started in 2000. They have 822 signatory investors representing $95 trillion. This is a number that you just can't comprehend, trillion, right? $95 trillion. That's a third of the global assets under management. So these are all companies that have said, we understand greenhouse gas emissions, climate change. These are things that we've got to account for. And I think I'll kind of end it there, and I can talk about things more. So a lot of innovation in the finance sector.
First of all, thank you so much. That was really great. I see a number of my students here, and I hope you'll take the chance to definitely meet Scott Haskell before you leave. I see all of you. I think that they used to say that economics was the dismal science, and as a political scientist, I feel myself that I don't want to be cynical. I have kids, I'd like to be optimistic. I think that the Paris deal was the best deal that they could have gotten, so realistically it was the best deal. Was it good enough? No. This is a deal that does not have enforcement mechanisms, that is not legally binding in many of the essential components of it, that it's primarily based on pledge and review. This is the core premise of the agreement. That is that every participant to the agreement makes a pledge, this independent, nationally determined contribution, and what they think they can do in terms of the carbon intensity or the total emissions. It's been kind of left up to them. And then they report, they're supposed to monitor what they do and report on it, and others can look at that, and it's supposed to be transparent. And so the primary mechanism for actually getting this agreement to work is supposed to be naming and shaming. In other words, you figure out who's done the wrong thing and shame them. And for any mechanism like that to work, you need a really big civil society, public opinion component behind it. In other words, if people drop the ball on this and leave it to the heads of state, or leave it to a few of the negotiators, this agreement is not going to make a difference. As it is, the agreement on its own terms, as the UN itself has recognized, and as Scott just mentioned, does not do the job of actually keeping us below the worrisome 2-degree rise. In fact, they mentioned aspirationally the 1.5-degree goal. That was a big victory of the Pacific Islands, the Marshall Islands, etc., that are at risk of going underwater, and that it was a I would say, a credit to the UN style of negotiation that these very small nations actually got a voice, and the moral outrage around the loss of their entire territory was great enough that it created the reference to 1.5 degrees rise. But the number that did not come up in your references to 2015 is the findings from February this year, which show that we are, as of February this year, at 1.35 degrees Celsius above the pre-industrial average temperatures, which means that the aspirational goal of trying to keep us below 1.5 degrees looks wildly optimistic. Certainly the view that we would meet every 5 years and ratchet up our pledges so that we can actually be on course to keep us below 2 degrees seems more urgent than ever, right? And so in view of all of that, I don't want to be I think there's a tremendously important role that all of us in this room and every person of conscience, but especially here in Cincinnati, that we can play. I'm going to get to that and explain why. And I'm especially pleased to have Scott on this panel, because I think this kind of energy in the corporate world and the expertise and the background that Scott represents, plus the fact that we have somebody here who was one of the original negotiators at Rio, this tells us a lot about the potential human capital that we have here in Cincinnati and the possible difference that we can make. And I have other reasons for thinking that what we have here is potentially a really important basis for launching some very significant changes in our country and our world. And so to start with, what I'll say is that I come from a political economy tradition of the study of the collective action problem. And the essence of the collective action problem is that if you leave people to their own self-interested activities, even if they understand this broader concept of the social good, even if they understand the broader concept of the collective well-being, they will act in self-interested ways that undermine their collective well-being. In other words, individual rationality leads to collective irrationality. And the classic example of this was presented by a biologist named Garrett Hardin in an article called The Tragedy of the Commons, which was very influential. And Hardin argued that if you leave people with a natural resource that many different people can access and use, and that natural resource can be maintained for the future as long as people don't abuse it, such as a pasture, for example. You have many shepherds using the pasture. That left to their own devices, people will abuse that pasture. Left to their own devices, they will overgraze the pasture, and as a result, they will destroy the soil, and future generations will not be able to use it. Right? And the premise of his argument is that even if each individual shepherd recognizes that there's a long-term danger in letting their sheep graze as much as they want in the pasture, they cannot, because they cannot be persuaded that everyone else is going to restrain themselves, they will also graze their sheep on the pasture. And as a result, because you don't have any enforcement mechanism to make sure that others are restraining their behavior, you have this collective catastrophe, the death of the pasture. So right now we're in a situation where the global climate commons, our atmosphere, is the greatest form of commons that we have experienced in the natural resource in our time. It is what we rely on. Historically, our species, our human civilizational history has been based on a certain average temperature, kind of above a range of 4 degrees below, 2 degrees below or 2 degrees above, meaning a total range of about 4 degrees. And so if you pass that range on either side, we don't know what will happen. What kinds of tipping points will let off, what sorts of sea level rises, what sorts of acidification of the oceans, what sorts of damage to our ecology, all the things that will set off extreme feedbacks that are very hard to predict but are very, very worrisome from the point of view of the well-being and the survival of our civilizations. So we can think of our global climate right now as a global commons, and the actions of individual countries, individual governments, individual corporations, individual investors, individual citizens, consumers, all of us as in some way being like we're little shepherds or big shepherds making use of that commons. And we know that if we all voluntarily restrained ourselves, we would prevent this great disaster. If we did what we needed to, which was to actually start the carbon reduction process right now and to head towards a carbon zero economy, we would have a chance of avoiding the worst effects of climate change, or the most worrisome effects. And unfortunately, because of the collective action problem, we are not going to do that. we need mechanisms. Now, what Garrett Hardin said was that there are two solutions. And this was the received wisdom in economics and political science for a long time. And he said there's two solutions. One solution is you can have government come in that establishes by command and control absolute rules that everyone everywhere must follow. No shepherd can use the pasture for more than 1 day a week. Or no person can emit more than this much carbon, right? Something like that. That's the state solution or the government solution, hierarchy. The other solution, Hardin said, was the market. He said that if you divide up the commons into little parcels and allow people to trade those parcels, then you still get voluntarily restraint, because now everyone can make use of their parcel as much as they like or destroy it as much as they like. And because both the costs and the benefits are accruing to them, they will not behave in this way that's collectively bad. And so in Hardin's view, these were the only solutions. And the reason that the Ostrom workshop at Indiana University is globally well known, and the reason that Eleanor Ostrom became the first woman and one of the few political scientists to win the Nobel Prize in economics, is that the research at the workshop and her work has demonstrated that this dichotomy is false. That it is not only the state and the market that can solve the problem of the commons. There are many instances of common situations in the world that have actually been solved by community self-governance, meaning communities that through consultative mechanisms and through mutual monitoring figure out ways to enforce each other's behaviors in ways that don't result in overgrazing and depleting the commons. And so the real world has typically in most situations some mix of community, market, and state. And what this suggests, the Eleanor Ostrom approach, is that we should consider the full range of alternatives. It doesn't mean that in any one situation, state is necessarily bad and community is always good. No, we have to look at the dynamics of the situation. And part of what the polycentric approach says, which James mentioned briefly in his introduction of my own work, is that that in contrast to the assumption that all rulemaking has to come only from one central point in government, the polycentric approach says we all participate in rulemaking all the time, as citizens, as members of corporations, as members of community organizations, as individuals in dorms, as people with families, as those of us deciding how to run our panel, right? All of those things involve some measure of rule agreement and rule deliberation. And in that sense, we are all making the rules from many different places. And we can make those rules in ways that better serve the goal of preventing the worst outcomes, or we can make rules in ways that hurt us in the long run. So we are the artisans, we are the devisers of the rules, and it is up to us to exercise our consciousness, our conscience, I should say, and transform our ethics into norms in ways that, and rules that actually result in the best outcomes. And so let me say briefly something about where I see the role of Cincinnati being, and then I'll turn it over to my colleague. The first thing is that the collective action problem is, just because there is a collective action problem, it does not mean that everybody's on the same page of what the good is. So we know that there are very, very intense efforts by well-organized interests to advocate for preventing a carbon tax, for example, or for advocate for continuing subsidies for the fossil fuel industry. Right? There are very strong political lobbies in this direction. So one of the absolutely essential things that I feel that must happen is there has to be a stronger coalition nationally, and it has to start from the ground up to counterbalance these very well organized, very powerful, and very wealthy interests that are preventing the needed actions that we need. And so that kind of participation in a broad political coalition is very important. I think the revenue neutral carbon tax is one that once it's gone through, it will create its own constituency. The way the revenue neutral carbon tax works is you get taxed on the amount of carbon that you emit. Everyone does, and it turns out that that they collect those taxes and then send it back an equal amount to every person. And that means that the people who use carbon very little get money back, and the ones who use carbon a lot end up paying a penalty. Right? And since the actual heavy users of carbon are relatively few and relatively concentrated, they will end up paying the burden of this, and most people will support the carbon tax. And it's not actually giving money to the government, it's giving money back to you, except it's distributing it according to the way that, to the amount of carbon that you use. And so once this proposal gets going, which I think is the best one that I'm aware of, it will create its own political constituency, but to get it going, we need that participation in a political coalition. The second thing, which is, I think, an extraordinarily important thing, several people might be wary about, I don't want to join some national political effort or something like that, or it seems like it's partisan or something. And I understand that kind of, there's an ick factor in politics, I understand that. And so there's another side, which is in our own thing. So for example, I live in a condo association, or we are participants here at Xavier University, or you might be in a corporation. There are many things that you can do within the context that you're involved in to change your carbon footprint and to make people more aware. And that kind of thing is collective action. It can be things like trying to advocate for more green sourcing of energy. It can be things that have to do with the investment of retirement funds. It can be things that have to do with collective buying decisions and thinking about the supply chains of the products that you buy and their carbon impact. So there are local things, and of the local things, I want to mention one particular aspect of Cincinnati that I absolutely treasure. I'm a transplant to Cincinnati, and it's become one of the reasons why I continue to feel so proud to be a member of the community here and so optimistic. Is that when I look at Cincinnati, I see extremely vibrant civic institutions, many of which are religious in nature. I see the Catholic Church. I see Hebrew Union College. I see we have a nice new Hindu temple, relatively new. We have a number of mosques. And if you look at these institutions, I'll focus on the ones that I'm familiar with, they are extremely well positioned as civic educators and as norm entrepreneurs. So civic education means transmitting to people some idea of how to be civic in our time. And in our time, the big civic challenges have to do with things like social justice and social justice related to climate change and mitigating or preventing the worst possible outcomes in climate change. And so from that point of view, I assume everyone here, and John will probably speak about this, is well familiar with Pope Francis's extremely eloquent and thoughtful teaching, Laudato Si, the Praise Be, which is a call for action on these environmental matters. But many of you may be less familiar with two other documents that I'll very briefly mention, and I'll pass it on. One is the Islamic Declaration on Climate Change, which takes many similar points to what Pope Francis has made, and it's not nearly as thorough, but it indicates a very strong parallel track and a desire to collaborate on this matter. And the other is a foundational document that is really an authoritative teaching in the Muslim community that is about Muslim-Christian relations in particular, and it's called the Common Word document, and it calls for Muslims and Christians to work together on the principles of the love of God and the love of neighbor for the common good. And it recognizes that unless we work together, the forces pulling us apart in terms of the people who talk about the clash of civilizations or the possibility of environmental destruction, unless we work together, these things will really drown us all. Right? So from that point of view, we have the big resources and the local institutions to promote a new kind of civic action in Cincinnati, to promote more collective action across group lines, across religious lines, across sect lines, across the lines that have traditionally kept us apart, and to promote the best kind of collective action that I hope would make Cincinnati a real model. And what religious institutions can do is they can start the process, and if they create enough of momentum, that can trigger conditional cooperation by many others who are waiting to see are others going along with this. And that would hopefully really set off a normative change. And so, let me stop there and move.
I'm going to change hats slightly. The other panelist that would have been here this evening is Nancy Berteau. She was in an accident weekend before last, and was not able to be here. So I'm going to make a few economic comments before I turn it to John. Drawing upon some of the comments that have been made, just to introduce a few economic terms. First of all, the economic term externalities. What are the externalities? What are the external costs? An externality is the cost of an individual or an institutional action that a greater community body has to pay for. An example would be smoking cigarettes. Individuals smoke cigarettes, they have health problems, that then we all end up having to pay the health cost the escalation in health costs because of that. The externalities connected with climate change are literally incalculable. Literally incalculable. I mean, they're given in the trillions of dollars of what this is costing us, big and small. So the question becomes, the economic question becomes, what level of crisis, and you can define crisis in economic terms, in health terms, in terms of conflict, in terms of carrying capacity issues, in terms of the extinction of species. At what level of crisis is it sufficient to cause us to dramatically change our economic life and our economic aspirations? Not just our lives, but our aspirations. What do we desire economically? And how dramatically would we change them? And when I say us, I mean us individually. I mean us in terms of institutions, in terms of communities, in terms of nations, and in terms of the world. At what point does the crisis become a crisis? One of the things that I'll often say when I'm doing environmental talks is the true environmental crisis is that in the 30 or so years that I've been doing this work, we have not convinced people there's a crisis. Because if we had, we would be dramatically changing our lives. We would be dramatically changing the way we live. We would be dramatically changing the structure of our economic and our social lives. But climate change on a day-to-day basis, or the climate crisis on a day-to-day basis, means very little to me here in Cincinnati. I don't feel it. If I had a medical crisis, and somebody said, you have a medical crisis, I wouldn't say, well, let me wait 30 years or so and see what's going to happen. If they told me I needed to make dramatic changes in my life, I would make dramatic changes in my life. Now, the hopeful side of this, and just some of the things that have been touched upon here, but we need to be conscious of. The 1.5 versus the 2 degrees Celsius. 1.5 centigrade actually is 2.7 degrees Fahrenheit, and 2 degrees Celsius is 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit. If you take all the 185 countries, 186 countries that submitted plans, if you take those plans and you even look at what you would get as a reduction by those plans, it would be about 3.4 degrees Celsius. So even with the most aspirational plans we have out there, we're not even going to get to 2, much less 1.5. So the crisis continues to become more and more exacerbated. China, which Scott mentioned. China's problem is 1.56 billion people who have to be fed, housed, they have to have jobs, they have to create. China is in an environmental crisis. 7 of the most 20 polluted rivers in the world are in China, and 5 of those are so polluted they cannot even use them for industrial purposes. You can't live near them, you can't use them. The pollution in Beijing and Shanghai and Chengdu and all of the major cities at times is beyond horrible. I have a son who's going there next year to be in the Peace Corps. We're sending him with masks and the demand that he wears them, because the air pollution is terrible. They realize they're in crisis. The problem is, how do you turn around the supertanker? Because the supertanker is moving and it takes a long time for it to pivot. So that's a problem. Second is, the OPEC nations played a huge economic role in the Paris negotiations. The elimination of all fossil fuels by 2030 was the original goal of Paris. The OPEC nations lobbied so that there was allowed for some fossil fuel production and use. And again, the ambiguity of that becomes a frightening thing. What is some? And how much is that? And not what is some just here in the United States or Germany, which are beginning to make the pivot, but what do you, when you talk about India, which is the other big specter on the screen here, you've got 300 million people in India living on less than $2 a day. are we supposed to say to them, you don't get economic development? And if we are going to say you get economic development, what do we mean by that? So the real problems in terms of those economics as well. The other issue here is the pledge, and it's just a pledge, an agreement, not a demand. In the text it's called a decision. It's not an action. That we need approximately $100 billion a year contributed into a pot, into a fund, to help those countries that are on the end of the spectrum of climate change, like the Pacific Islands, like the developing countries, who really need some kind of support if they're going to be brought in line. Now, the problem with this is that when we, in Rio, we only asked for $5 billion a year. And since 1992, we have not gotten $5 billion 1 year. So these decisions or these agreements aren't binding. And it goes back to how you can enforce this. In Durban, remember what they wanted were legally binding agreement. Legally binding. What does it mean to be legally binding? One of the ways to think about this, in 1992, within a year of each other, we passed the Uruguay round of GATT, which formed the WTO, and we passed the Earth Summit protocols. One is enforceable, and the other is not enforceable. What has happened in that time? The free market has proliferated with all the environmental costs of that, and Agenda 21 has not really been put in place. So the $100 billion, where does that come from? And how do we do that? Now the good side of this, the positive, hopeful side of this, is that as the big companies are making what Andrew Winston is calling the big pivot, Procter & Gamble and Kroger and General Electric, they all understand that they need to make the pivot to sustainability. Being sustainable is good business. And they understand that it's good business. They also have the capital to be able to make the pivot. The real crisis, and it's one that Scott and I are dealing with locally, is how do you help the small and medium-sized businesses who are in those supply chains also make that pivot? They don't have the capital to do it. We have to put money into that, public money into that, to try to empower them to also make the pivot that the big companies are doing. Now, that's something that we can do on a local and regional level. All of these things, living more sustainable lives, happens first individually. It then begins to happen within a community. Then it begins to happen in a region, which is why we've moved our summit from a local summit to a regional summit to hopefully then a national move and then hopefully a global move. But again, we go back to the question, at what level of crisis is it sufficient that it would warrant us making dramatic changes in our economic lives? And I'll turn it to Johnson about it. I hope I did Nancy well when Nancy's feeling well.
Thank you, James. And thank you to Scott and Hannes and to James for, I think, setting the context here very, very well on a lot of dimensions of the climate crisis. What I'm going to try to add to this is just a few words about Pope Francis and his attempt to make an impact on these conversations over the past year, particularly his encyclical Laudato Si on care for our common home. Have any of you actually read the encyclical? So if you have, I do highly recommend it. It's one of the few papal documents that are actually quite readable. And it's very well written, and I think a very, very powerful document to read so simply.
And just to say, if you read that document and this document, you've only read about 153 pages. So it's not long. It's got 121, right?
100 somewhere. This was the first papal encyclical ever devoted primarily to ecological themes, although it should be said not the first papal statement devoted to ecological themes. So it's been the past 25 plus years that the folks have been talking extensively about these issues. Back in 1990, the same year that James was talking about the beginnings of some of the negotiations around climate change, Pope John Paul II issued a powerful document called The Ecological Crisis, A Common Responsibility. Pope Benedict followed up, who's often referred to as the Green Pope, for his strong emphasis on ecological issues. But Francis, I think, has embodied that in a way more than has made it more public, that the Church has been talking about these kinds of things. And it wasn't a coincidence that Pope Francis issued this encyclical just a few months before the Paris climate talks. He had a very keen sense that this was a pivotal time in human history, and he wanted to make his contribution to that. He saw these talks as perhaps the world's last best chance to begin to take some of the needed steps to address the climate crisis. We heard 1990 talks began, but from 1990 to 2013, some figures I've seen, carbon dioxide emissions actually rose about 60%. So clearly the talks have not been accomplishing much. And the Pope's fear was that if this round didn't begin to make a difference, that we could reach some of these tipping points beyond which there may not be a way to get back and prevent the worst. So he sought to bring a moral framework and moral pressure to bear in the time leading up to the talks, centered upon our moral responsibilities to the poor, to the earth and its creatures, and to future generations, hoping that this moral framework would help the climate change discussion to break beyond the partisan political framework that has hindered governmental action, especially in the U.S. context. In addition to the encyclical, which was issued in June of last year, 2015, the Vatican also sponsored several conferences on climate change over the summer, and the topic of climate change featured prominently in Pope Francis' public statements during his visit to the United States in September of 2015, including comments at the White House in praise of some of the measures that President Obama had proposed to address climate change, such as his Clean Power Plan, which we can maybe talk a little bit more about in our discussion later. Significantly, when President Obama had first announced his Clean Power Plan, he made explicit reference to Pope Francis' encyclical in his remarks, in some sense that the Pope's contribution has made an impact on public conversation. One of the striking things about Pope Francis' encyclical and his other comments on climate change is the profound sense of urgency that the Pope expresses. Pope Francis understands well that the world's leading climate scientists are warning that our time for taking significant action may be quite limited, perhaps a decade or less before we pass some of these irreversible tipping points. And that notion of tipping points also is something we might want to come back to more in our conversation. In comments to the press at the start of the Paris climate talks in December, the Pope expressed his view that the time for action was, quote, now or never, warning that humanity was, quote, on the edge of suicide. So some very strong language. Time, my brothers and sisters, Pope Francis said in a powerful talk to a worldwide gathering of grassroots movements meeting in Bolivia last July, seems to be running out. We are tearing apart our common home. Today, the scientific community realizes that the poor have long told us harm, perhaps irreversible harm, is being done to the ecosystem. In Laudato Si, the ecological encyclical, the Pope said, quote, doomsday predictions can no longer be met with irony or disdain. The pace of consumption, waste, and environmental change has so stretched the planet's capacity that our contemporary lifestyle, unsustainable as it is, can only precipitate catastrophes. The effects of the present imbalance can only be reduced by our decisive action here and now. We need to reflect on our accountability before those who will have to endure the dire consequences. And in the encyclical, Pope Francis outlines in some detail what these current and future consequences of climate change involve. Some of these you're familiar with, some of you may not as much, but including, of course, rising sea levels, increased strength of severe weather events such as hurricanes, increased droughts and floods, drinking water shortages, reductions in agricultural productivity, widespread species extinction, the spread of disease, ocean acidification, and other major problems for the oceans, the creation of climate refugees, and the potential for increased violent conflict and extremist movements, among others. And Pope Francis points out that many of these impacts will be felt in the short run, especially on those who have had least responsibility historically for causing the problem in the first place. So places like Sub-Saharan Africa, Central America, and some other regions of the world that have already been experiencing and will continue to experience the worst impacts of climate change. In analyzing the causes of our current crisis, Pope Francis highlights several main factors. These include, above all, in his understanding, a dominant economic system in our world today that Francis views as highly unjust and unsustainable, generating both massive inequality and severe ecological harm. Let us not be afraid to say it, Pope Francis proclaimed to the worldwide gathering of grassroots movements in Bolivia. We want change, real change, structural change. This system is by now intolerable. The current system, the Pope argues, is, quote, centered on the god of money and on conceptions of deified markets that pay little concern to the well-being of the poor and of the earth. Responding to these two realities, the cry of the poor and the cry of the earth, which Francis sees as very much interconnected, are for Francis at the heart of Christian faith, and so socioeconomic transformation to a more just and ecologically sustainable global system are seen as crucial priorities. The second deep root of our ecological crises, according to Pope Francis, is what he terms a technocratic worldview, one which speaks in terms of mastery, domination, control, and consumption in relation to the natural world. In contrast, the Pope highlights the importance of a more contemplative approach to life, characterized by recognition of our profound interconnectedness with each other and with the rest of creation. In his words, we need to find ways to, quote, feel intimately united with all that exists. This gives rise to attitudes of awe, wonder, appreciation of beauty, care, and to use one of Pope Francis's favorite words, tenderness. According to Pope Francis, what is needed is not simply new technological innovations or political economic reforms, though all of these are essential, but also a profound cultural and spiritual transformation, a change in our very basic ways of viewing and relating to the world. Concretely, Pope Francis calls for a variety of reforms that would flow from this transformed way of viewing the world, both public policy reforms and personal lifestyle changes. In terms of policy, he calls for a rapid transition away from fossil fuels to renewable energy, suggesting that businesses be required to internalize the full cost of their products. So James was talking earlier about externalities. It's basically the same thing that Pope's talking about here, saying that the social costs, ecological costs of fossil fuels in particular have not been internalized in the cost of those products, and those costs are put on society as a whole. And so, indirectly here, at least, making a case for something along the lines of a tax on carbon. He also calls for increased emphasis on energy efficiency, enhanced governmental regulations to minimize greenhouse gas emissions and protect the environment in general, including binding regulations at the international level. So the Pope would be critical of the non-binding nature of the agreements at Paris. He calls as well for improved transportation systems, more ecologically sustainable agricultural systems, measures to overcome poverty, again, seeing poverty and ecological destruction as connected, and substantive amounts of aid from the richer nations to the poorer nations, something James was again talking about, a payment of what the Pope terms an ecological debt that is owed by the nations most responsible for the climate crisis to the poorer nations, to help the poorer nations to be able to invest in some of the needed technologies, etc. Pope Francis recognizes that these changes will meet enormous levels of resistance from those who have vested economic interest in the current system, especially fossil fuel companies. And importantly, he highlights the need, as Manas was talking about, for widespread grassroots social movements to overcome this resistance and bring about policy change. And that's really one of the major contributions of this Pope to Catholic social teaching, is that he understands the need for kind of mass mobilization and the support and building of grassroots movements around the world, rather than relying on policymakers simply to do the right thing. At the personal level, Pope Francis calls for simplification of lifestyles on the part of the wealthy, which he argues should properly be viewed as a very joyful thing. Resistance to a throwaway culture, and commitment by all to what he terms ecological conversion. One lifestyle issue he doesn't explicitly address, but which I think follows well from the principles that he articulates, is attention to our dietary choices. James had mentioned him working on a book on food ethics. But many people don't realize that leading climate experts, such as James Hansen, the former head of NASA's Climate Science Division, Project Showery, the former chair of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, most respected body of climate change, Experts have both argued that in terms of individual choices, reducing meat and dairy consumption are actually some of the most important steps that can be taken to reduce our personal contributions to greenhouse gas emissions. Again, perhaps something we can talk more about in our conversation later. Above all, in the midst of the dire crises in which we find ourselves, Pope Francis seeks to offer a message of hope. A hope that people acting together in a God-inspired spirit of solidarity and intimacy with creation can still make, to use the Pope's words, the bold and radical changes that our time requires of us. And along these lines, I'd just like to end with a quote from Pope Francis from Laudato Si'. He says, "In union with all creatures, we journey through this land seeking God. Let us sing as we go. May our struggles and our concern for this planet never take away the joy of our hope." Thank you.
Before turning and opening up to everybody, let me just pick up a couple of points that I think relates to all three. Honest talks about, Dr. Mark talked about polycentric and the need of local governance and regulations. How do we move to more regulatory structures in the face of both individual self-interest, which in a culture such as ours, which is so ruled by individualism, and corporate self-interest, right? How do we move to that? And then to bring it back here, what role can religion play in helping us do that? I mean, because we can have the best intentions, but we are economically self-interested individually, we're economically self-interested corporately, and even in terms of religious institutions to some degree. But how do we address that? Because I agree with Karen Hart to some degree. And what would your response be? And actually, what you might all say is, Scott comes from the corporate world, Honest comes from the educational world, and I'll let you speak to the Catholic Church. Or not. What might we do within those three very different institutional settings? If you had the ability to make small changes or not dramatic sweeping changes, what would you recommend?
Okay, so maybe I'll start by, first of all, I think that that the focus on regulation as coming only from the central government authority is very disempowering to the community at large. And it removes from the picture what, I mean, when people talk about regulation like that, then I understand it's very important to have regulation like that. But even if you had a far more binding Paris Agreement, even if you had something close to what Pope Francis was advocating at the Paris level only, without the mass citizen action, without the awareness of individuals actually holding their communities to account, the changes that we need would not happen. So you need that monitoring and that accountability, and that has to come from a really vibrant civic component. The reality is that we have been left with, by and large, a major vacuum of activity that needs to be filled by something if we're going to make the changes that need to be made. So one of them is pressing for things in terms of public opinion and a coalition for regulatory change. The other is local activism that tries to transform things. And so there's two components to this that I think that I personally focus on. One is, as an educator and also as a participant, especially in the Muslim community here, I'm very interested in persuading people of the intrinsic value of these kinds of changes. In other words, if you can convince a core critical mass people that it's intrinsically valuable to move towards a low carbon economy, a local kind of sustainable way of being, if that's intrinsically valuable, they will make the change irrespective of the fact that not everyone else is doing it. And then if enough people do that, then others will follow suit. And that's what the studies of conditional cooperation show, that there are a lot of people who on their own won't do anything with it, but if they see others doing something, they're more willing to. Just as if you send people an electric bill and explain to others how little electricity your neighbors are using compared to you, that's much more likely to get you to try to reduce your consumption than just than some other metric, because it kicks off the conditional cooperation mechanism. So those are two components that I think are very important. The other thing is, and this is I think particular to the United States, we are in general in the last 30 years, especially in the United States, suffering from degradation of our civic society. In other words, our ability to mutually problem solve, to meet with people who are different in their interests, whether it's Democrats and Republicans, or people on different sides of an issue, and to resolve things in collective ways. And that side, what I call the social commons, is essential to resolving these other problems. And so part of revivifying our community and addressing these is also helping build that social commons, which in turn will generate more solutions. Because the specific solutions are going to be different for every arena. And it's up to thoughtful, deliberative, engaged people to work to problem solve so that they can meet their interests, so that they can try to accomplish these things. And I see just in that list there are very interesting things. That's specifics.
Thank you. I'm really glad he took the first crack at that. He set this up really nicely, I think. One of the things that I didn't mention at the beginning is I spent 10 years in DC working on energy policy, environmental policy issues, climate change. So that's kind of the hat that my earlier comments, that was the hat I was wearing with my earlier comments. One of the things that I worked on towards the end of my time in DC was on voluntary programs. So things where, why is it that you might get a company to go above and beyond the law? And there are a whole lot of reasons why that became an interesting topic for people to study and look at. One of them is that we haven't been able to pass any major environmental laws in this country for a very long time. And the prospects aren't great. And so if you want to make movement on a lot of these things, you have to kind of find these other ways to address these things and kind of help people find that there really are better ways through, sometimes just being clever. You can find new ways to do things that are cheaper. Sometimes they can kind of be enlightened, just doing it for the greater good. There are a lot of different ways that you can do the kinds of things that Anas was talking about. Green Umbrella, and part of what I'm trying to do in the last 6 years at Fifth Third is kind of help raise awareness about these voluntary programs, help pull these arguments together, get the information, make the arguments, and then figure out how do you bring that to an 18,000 person organization that's going through a lot of other change and make those things stick. But going to the community side of things, this loss of civic engagement, really, really important. I mean, you see that in spades in our country. But I think this is one of the things that's really exciting about Green Umbrella. It is all about making this hyper-local, about taking all the politics out of it, recreating that civic engagement that cuts across the public, private sector, nonprofit sectors, getting these discussions going because it's about where we all live. And I think that's how we start to rebuild this fabric and find a way to tackle these challenges. So, I feel like a lot of the discussion that we've had can kind of sound overwhelming and depressing. But after working on these things for 18 years, I'm actually really optimistic about where we're finally headed. Getting started. Yes, we don't have the perfect agreement out of COP21, but we finally have a start, and that's what we really needed. When I was in grad school, I took a class with Rob Stavins, who's an environmental economist, and in 1998 he said, look, we economists, we've already solved climate change. We've told you how to solve it with economics. Now it's up to the political scientists to figure out how to implement this. And I think that's a lot of what we're struggling with, is how do you get started? So, and I think, once we've kind of rebuilt the fabric and got this innovation going, I think the regulatory system may be able to catch up. I mean, we may be able to say, okay, we collectively have decided that there is a role for the government to play, that they can do certain things more efficiently. And so maybe then we'll kind of catch up, but that's not the way that we're going to start solving this. So.
Yeah, I think the Catholic Church and the religious community more generally can help simply by talking about the issue. I often ask my students, how many of you have ever heard a sermon on ecological themes, even though we've had posts for the past 30 years saying this is an integral part of what it means to be Catholic. It's not something optional. The ecological crisis is a primary concern of the human community in our time and place. but we don't get, how many of you have heard of sermon on ecological means? But I think the Pope's document has helped with that. I mean, some of the public polling that you see has shown somewhat significant change in Catholic perceptions over the past year on climate change issues. That also represents some broader shifting of the public at large, so in a positive direction. I mean, going from a rather low, less than half, thinking that climate change was real or a serious problem to getting up above that. But I think talking about it as a moral issue, talking about it in terms of concern for our children, but also seeing it impacts now on the worst in the world, and trying to get it out of the realm of partisan politics so that we can break down some of those ways it's perceived in this country especially. But beyond that, I think the church is beginning to do visible things themselves. Things like putting up solar panels on the church, so Quaker meeting when I happen to live in the caretakers of the Quaker meeting just on not far from campus. And we put on solar panels, which was primarily done as a theological witness, but the reality is, in the long run, it's going to save the meeting a good bit of money as well. So there's no reason that the churches that have the right facility or grounds where they can do roofing, ground mounted, depending, you couldn't be doing this if they saw it as a priority, because it's going to more than pay for itself in the long run. But I think projects like that can touch people and reach people in ways that simply words won't. Or even say you're building, fine buildings like the new classroom building that has some significant ecological features to it, but they aren't that visible. And I think it's not something that impinges upon people's confidence on a daily basis, whereas even just having one place on campus where there was a building with significant solar or something that was visible, I think would make more of a day-to-day impact pedagogically on people. And so just seeing it as an important enough issue to make those investments that are more than pay for themselves over time, but involve some upfront, expenditures to be one way to get that process going and have people thinking about it.
I can't help but ask, do you think that Laudato Si should have been binding?
Okay, let's run that.
Well, there are lots of binding doctrines. I mean, in whatever way, should it be binding? I mean, it's a teaching, but if it was binding, you would have more than two hands that have been raised when you ask the question, whose word asserted?
I mean, it's meant to be in that sense. I mean, the Pope certainly talks about that this should become integral to Catholic education at every level, especially seminarians. That hasn't been implemented, but I think that the need to integrate that more into every aspect of Catholic education from the parish life to the training of priests and others is certainly.
And Scott, I mean, you're in the corporate world. Do you sense, not only just in Fifth Third, but in the engagement that you have in the corporate world around you, that there is a sense of urgency about this, or is it something that is being done by certain people within the institutions? I mean, you hear it from institutional urgency?
I'll say just, again, speaking as a citizen, not who's focused on these things, not specifically speaking about Fifth Third. Yes, certainly some companies are viewing this more urgently than others. I think part of the urgency, the driver of the urgency, though, is a little bit different. It's, especially for large global companies that are trying to work around the world, they kind of view their ability to expand and to grow as being tied to being a socially responsible actor, especially in developing countries that are more on the forefront of dealing with some of these issues. And so I think they're seeing that they've got to figure out how to grow in a much more sustainable way. And so they're really diving in and understanding these issues much faster and trying to figure out how to solve them so that they can talk about it in those markets and then bring it back here to consumers. So I think in a lot of ways the consumers are really driving this more so than the fear of imminent regulation. But I think people also, organizations are also looking at this on a lot of different levels simultaneously and thinking, okay, if this kind of gives us a license to operate in these other areas and to be able to grow, if you're trying to enter China or India and create billion-dollar businesses, you're going to want to figure out how to do this sustainably. At the same time, you might think, well, if we figure this out now, if and when we get regulated, we're going to have already solved this problem. So there's I think all these different levels of thinking about things, whether it's at the theological level, the economic level, the moral, the economic, the technical. I mean, sometimes any particular one can be depressing, but together they help move us all in the right direction. So I think they all play a really important role in doing this.
I mean, it seems to me that the key term in Laudato Si is that one, ecological conversion. To what degree do we all go through some kind of conversion like that, which is always a matter of self-transcendence. We can't get to real collective action until we have some level of self-transcendence, until we begin to reconstitute associations and communities who can have a common good, have a common thing, a good that they're responding to, not just a crisis. And in some ways, the young people out here, this is really going to fall on you. That you, again, with the original Earth Summit, what we thought the main motivating factor behind that was going to be was that we were going to do this for future generations. It turned out we didn't really care that much about future generations. As John has pointed out, emissions increased by 60% in the intervening time. But it's going to, really, the responsibility is going to fall on you all in whatever work life, individual life, community life you have. So with that, let me open it up to questions and or comments. And anything that you guys over here want to say. I think there is a microphone, isn't there, Cynthia? Did they not bring it? Well, just speak up. It's fine. I thought they said they would bring one. Let me see if they brought it.
Okay. I will also say, if you're interested, I brought a resource list that I pass out in my classes, and so I'll pass around.
That's good too.
Take a copy of some interesting articles, videos, books related to climate change.
Yes, this one. So there's a question. I'll walk around with this. Come on. There you go. Thank you.
From 2007 to 2015, I worked at the United Nations as the representative for the Sisters of Charity Federation. And one of the, I've worked on numerous committees, but especially in the area of climate change and poverty. Also with interreligious dialogue. And when you were speaking, I was thinking, one of the initiatives that we did as NGOs was we decided to hold a year-long program on spirituality and sustainability. And we brought people together from multiple religious traditions. We looked at things like the Islamic document and other documents from different religious traditions. And I think something like that could certainly work here in the city if we brought together people around that, because what we discovered was there was no doctrine involved in this. You know, we came together around something that we all truly believed in, and it really made a difference.
Anybody else? Comments or questions?
I noticed that you guys didn't talk much about the greenhouse gases being emitted from cows. What do you believe that plays a role in the future, and how we should change that?
Right. John, if you want.
Right, so I touched upon that briefly. So that, I mean, one striking figure that people often aren't familiar with is that there's more greenhouse gas emissions related to the livestock industry than the emissions from all forms of transportation combined, which is a quite striking figure. It comes from a UN report from a few years back. So it's not only the emissions from working with cows and things like that, but that includes the deforestation connected with livestock, and includes all the growing of, the corn and soybeans and things that are fed to the animals. But that's one of the reasons that people like James Hansen and Representative Power, these key climate change figures, are saying that one of the best things we can do in terms of personal decisions is to reduce meat and dairy consumption. It's not that in and of itself is solving the climate change problem, but the argument is, particularly around methane, that it's a very potent greenhouse gas, but it cycles out of the atmosphere quickly. So if you could significantly reduce, for example, the number of cows, it buys a little bit more time to make the broader political changes and changes in the energy infrastructure systems and things like that that are needed. So it's one part of a broader systemic change that's needed, but those dietary choices certainly are an important one to have awareness of.
So we talked a lot about how oil really plays a big factor in this. The United States being so oil dependent, is fossil fuel dependent in general. And the fossil fuel companies right now purposely keeping the oil prices fairly low, under $80 a barrel, just so renewable energy isn't worth it. What would incentivize the United States to make any policy when we are so fossil fuel heavy to make it so renewable energy is worth it when it's just so cheap right now that if we try to flip over it, no company really would think about flipping just for the economic side. That makes sense.
How do you make it work economically? I mean, that's the point. We can say it's a moral argument and it should work morally, but if it doesn't work economically, people aren't going to do it.
And just a quick initial answer, again, speaking as an individual. I think one of the ways that I prefer to tackle these things is, instead of trying to go after a particular issue, like, how do we get gasoline out of the system or diesel fuel, is try to think more holistically, a bigger picture, and then rank order in a way, where do we want to focus? And so, a transition on the gas in terms of gasoline, I think I wouldn't necessarily tackle that one first. I think looking at the power sector is a way to start this transition, and if we can use that through some through some evolution, regulatory, otherwise, whether it's cap and trade or it's a price on carbon, if you can start introducing those sorts of structural changes in the power sector, then it can kind of cascade into some of the other areas and create price signals that are going to figure out what's an economically efficient way for us to get from point A to point B in terms of transition. But I think in my mind, it's how do we create a price signal that is going to fix these externalities and then lead to a better solution, instead of trying to say, how do we get gasoline out of the system? I worked at the U.S. Department of Energy in the Energy Efficiency Renewable Energy Office for 3 years, and which has home to the Hydrogen Vehicles Program and the Hydrogen Program that the U.S. Department of Energy runs. And it's really hard to say, okay, how do we get from today to a hydrogen-based transportation system? I think that's not the right way to do it. It's to figure out how do we create these price signals that are going to lead us to better solutions. And then, whatever they may be, who knows? Obviously, hybrid vehicles have improved a lot. Battery technology keeps improving, and I feel like that's going to lead us to a better solution.
And one of the things that we're alluding to is where, because of economies of scale, the price point to a kilowatt per hour has dropped so dramatically that we all, given a certain capitalization, have the potential to stop merely being consumers of energy and can be producer consumers. The new term we use is prosumers of energy. And so one of the bright things is that wind and solar, because of economy of scale, are becoming affordable within reasonable time horizons. And everything has time horizons. In other words, you have the capital outlay, but then, as John has pointed out and others, it begins to pay itself back. If we could figure out a way to fill that capital gap for people, and we do it with, right now with solar, we have federal tax breaks, we even have a city incentive for this. If we can do that, then the more people that do it, the price per kilowatt hour continues to go down, and more people will do it, and those patterns change, and we begin to get a different type of world, I think. So that's a level. To try to address just getting rid of fossil fuels instantly, we have too many hundreds of millions of cars on the road right now. How do you transform them all? How do you move them off the road instantly? So we have to work at a lower level or a more individual level, honestly.
Well, first, okay, yeah. So I really appreciate the previous responses, and I understand, that, but I have to say that first of all, not all fossil fuels are equal. Coal is a real dirty one, right? And right now we're on track, despite the pledges, that they're going to be building about 1,000 more coal plants between India and China, right? So these are coming online. The United States is starting to turn the supertanker around in James' metaphor, but strategically it might be wise to try to eliminate those as fast as you can, but we're not even doing that, much less gas. With regards to gas, and the dash to gas, which people are treating gas as relatively clean, so I think it's a long-term real mistake. I do think that it's essential that we as investors, we as consumers, and we as citizens think very actively about the corporate social responsibility movement and the divestment movement. And the fact is that if we think about our voice, we have voice as investors. We have voice, all of us have investment, like everyone do, the other job is directly or indirectly linked to an investment account, right? We have university endowments that invest in things. And you may be somebody who does not support the divestment platform, and that's okay. Support the voice platform. If the two together, the choice of exit or voice that Albert Hirschman, a famous economist, talked about, those two things, if they're applied together, can really change things around. And so I do think we cannot leave that off the table. It's a really important thing to be aware of and to participate in if you feel strongly enough about it, particularly using investor dollars. The other thing I would say, and this is one of the grounds for optimism about Paris, is that the model that Paris could succeed with is the indicative planning model. Indicative planning means this is giving a signal to the markets that this is where things are headed. It's headed to a world beyond fossil fuels. And that once you give that signal, then a good, smart thinking business will start investing in sustainable other renewables as their basis of energy. And you get some movements. It's very hard to tell how real this is, but even Saudi Arabia, which has its entire political economy locked up as the largest OPEC reserve holder of oil, even Saudi Arabia has recently announced a plan to sell off its oil assets. Right? In other words, to try to make most of its national income on something. Now, I don't know how real that is, how symbolic it is, but it shows that the signal is having some kind of an effect.
I think one other symbolic thing would be the Rockefeller Foundation, which of course most of its
Creators.
wealth through oil have announced a plan to fully divest from fossil fuels. Primarily, in my understanding, for economic reasons, seeing that the trend is going to be away and that there are, as Bill McKibben and others from the organization 350.org, which I highly recommend if you're interested in kind of the grassroots social movements around climate change. They've been pointing out that when you just look at the sheer numbers, we probably have to leave something like 4/5 of the known reserves of fossil fuels in the ground to not go beyond these 2-degree sort of tipping point limits. That obviously, if that actually happens, will be a lot of lost revenues for the fossil fuel companies, which is, of course, why they're fighting against it so strongly. But many investors are saying that is where the future's headed, and it's wise to get out now. And on a positive side, I think some of the figures I've seen, at least in the U.S. context, that the investment in new fuel production in recent years has been more in solar and wind than in coal plants or things like that. It's not getting rid of too well, even the old ones, to some extent. And we haven't talked about the President Obama's Clean Power Plan, which was seen as one of the main contributions or things that the U.S. would do to try to live up to its commitments at the Paris Climate Accords. And if that is allowed to go into effect, right now it's been stayed by a decision of the Supreme Court to hold off until some lower courts can rule in some lawsuits against it. But if that is allowed to proceed, we'd at least begin to make a significant dent in beginning a transition more away from fossil fuels and closing more of the coal plants that would be able to meet the standards and hinder the creation of new coal plants. But that's likely to be determined in part by our political process. And that's an important point here.
So, being from Kentucky, this is a major issue that's coming up right now with coal. Everybody's talking about closing down the coal plants, we have coal companies filing bankruptcy left and right. How do we transition economies as a whole, such as the Eastern Kentucky, where there's only one major highway that serves that entire part of the state? How do we transition economies that have been primarily reliant on coal and fossil fuels in general to different forms? How do we tell people whose whole lives and generations of families have grown up knowing this one thing, maybe with very little education as well? How do we tell them and start beginning to change them over the next 15, 20 years?
Small question. Just a couple of quick thoughts to you speaking as an individual. This is a topic that has certainly come up comes up all the time. And I think, when I think back to the times I've heard this come out, be brought up, I feel like the first time I was sitting with an economist at Harvard University who was saying, hey, the simplest thing is to set up a cap and trade system, or set something up and basically just pay off the coal miners, which is not really the spirit of your question, but at some level saying, hey, look, if you're trying to solve these problems, it's helpful to think about that there can be winners, there can be losers, and this is the role of the politicians to figure out how can we help solve these challenges. And so, a pure economist who's not worried about political problems and saying, well, just write them a check. That's not the right answer in the world that we live in. But that's, I think, again, where we actually need to have a set of discussions where people try to solve problems instead of oversimplify and misrepresent what's really going on. Some of the discussions about what's happened to coal in Kentucky, sometimes those discussions are presented in terms of what a particular president or his proposals are about, without discussing any of the trends about natural gas pricing and what it is that has led to a lot of the changes in the coal industry over the last 5 years. The Clean Power Plan was not proposed until the fall, and a lot of these plants have closed over the past 5 years. So it's helpful to really look at the facts and have a fact-based discussion about how we solve these problems. And I think that's where we need the politicians to be involved in solving real problems, not ones that they're creating to make it harder to deal with the real problems.
And as the economist Schumpeter points out, and it goes back to Dr. Malik's point about market signals, economic systems work by a principle that he calls creative destruction, so that things will be destroyed and things will be created, and the market signals will do that. So where there's a need, and if we have to change these patterns, the patterns will change. And we'll figure out a way to do it. And out of this will come all new industries, will come lots of innovation. Come and listen to Paul Hawken in June. Paul Hawken's got a catalog of these kinds of innovations that are going to be the leading edge of some of the creative destruction that's going on within the economy. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? It's neither. It's a market thing. But ecologically, it can be a good thing. And I think that, do you have a question here?
Tell me exactly how cap and trade works. I know the concept, but in practice, specifically, how does it die? And what countries do it, and how do they do it? And how can it be done?
One of you guys want to answer that? Who's our cap and trade person? Good guy? All right.
Somebody should take it closer over.
Yeah, that would help. So basically cap and trade, in terms of emissions, the cap part, obviously you cap emissions, and then the most efficient companies the most efficient companies can have extra credits that they're given, and they can trade those in the free market and make a profit off those. So it rewards innovation on the most efficient companies. So if you can drive down emissions, then you can make a profit on the extra credits that you're given.
So you're trading energy credits. Energy becomes a currency.
And over time, you generally reduce the amount of credits available. So it's
a
a
market producer. But it really becomes a market for energy with incentives for reduction built in. If that makes sense.
So who gets does the company get the benefit first?
Does the company get the benefit?
If I use less gas or less electricity or less gasoline, does that make a difference?
If he uses less gas and less energy, does it make a difference for him individually?
Hi, my name is Gabby. I'm a land major, and I only know the answer to this question in the context of actually Central Ohio's local water bodies. And so I can answer your question in terms of the Ohio EPA and their attempt to cap pollution in water systems, and it works about the same way. So basically, you look at the companies that are currently polluting, and you allocate a certain number of credits to each of those. And so those companies that aren't able to make cost-effective reductions to their pollution, for example, would need more credits than they've been allocated. Then in opposition of that, there are those companies that are already being environmentally responsible, that don't need as many credits as they've been granted, and so they can sell those to the other companies that would require them from them. So yes, innovation absolutely is a benefit, because then the profit that you make from those credits is because you're already doing what would be required of you to be environmentally responsible. In other words, if you are a polluter, you're going to ultimately have to pay more for that pollution in the long run anyhow, particularly when, as Dr. Snigocki mentioned, those credits begin to decrease in number per institution, if that helps.
Just a quick comment on this. Part of the transition that I thought was really interesting in 2015 was to see that a lot of these non-state actors really made a change in their strategy to say, look, governments need to figure out a solution to this problem, and we, these non-state actors, are agnostic about what the solution looks like, but we're starting to demand that you figure out a solution. And so I think that's a nice change, because it at least says that politicians are going to need to get engaged in this enough to solve the problem, because the question of taxes versus a tax versus a cap and trade system. If you were to do a cap and trade system, who do you give the allowances to, or what's the mechanism for assigning those allowances? Do you give them to people? Do you sell them? These are difficult policy questions, and they're the kinds of questions that have stifled the discussion and policy-making process in DC for 20 years. And so they are really important. They have consequences. If you look in the UK, they had a particular approach to doing it. California's had an approach. I mean, these things do matter, but I think part of what was really nice about 2015 was seeing a solid stance that we need to solve this problem. And yes, someone's going to have to figure this stuff out, but let's not let the national discussion get bogged down in it for right now. And that's part of how I think we got an agreement in Paris.
I think one of the messages that I hope you go away from here with is go get involved. Get involved in your community politically, get involved in it in terms of saying things like Green Umbrella. I mean, one of the things that's at stake in the election is this is not a treaty. This is simply an executive action. And so that while President Obama can sign it on the 21st, if another president comes in and doesn't like it, it can be wiped away, because it's not being submitted for Senate approval as a treaty, which would give it a binding force. So that's the necessity of political involvement, the necessity of associative involvement in organizations like Green Umbrella, is that real change will happen from the bottom up. It will happen through the kind of collective action that Dr. Malik has spoken about. And the beautiful thing about this community is we have a wonderful organization that has been put together, whether you're interested in waste, water, trails, air, it doesn't matter. There's a working group. There are 8 different working groups within Green Umbrella. We have major conferences that we're doing. They're looking for people to volunteer and do the work. It's a great bunch of people. I can attest to that because I work with them. So the message here is go get involved in your community. Go get involved in what's going on. And together we can begin to address some of these things. Help me in thanking our panelists for being here.